in recent years, we've seen governors, state legislatures, pundits, university presidents, and members of Congress of both major parties referring to efforts such as the tactic of boycotts, divestment, sanctions targeting Israel, or even just the Israeli occupation as inherently anti-Semitic. The Trump administration, despite its close associations with anti-Semites, has repeatedly insisted that it is not their right-wing allies, but left-leaning human rights activists supporting Palestinian rights who are at the forefront of growing anti-Semitism in the United States. In many cases, such accusations can simply be dismissed as a kind of disingenuous McCarthyism designed to discredit peace and human rights activists, such as charges of communism were labeled in previous decades against those who opposed the Vietnam War and US intervention in Central America. Ironically, such false charges can create a kind of crying wolf phenomenon where more credible charges of anti-Semitism within the movement for Palestinian rights are not taken as seriously as they should. Despite these disingenuous charges by supporters of Israel's right-wing government, though, there are some cases where such concerns should not be summarily dismissed. Defending the legitimate human rights of Palestinians must not be used as an excuse for spreading anti-Semitism. So I'd like to address some of the controversial issues regarding pro-Palestinian activism in relation to anti-Semitism. First of all, there's a question, is opposition to Zionism, the Jewish nationalist movement that led to the establishment of modern Israel, inherently anti-Semitic? My own view is that it's not anti-Semitic to argue, for example, that whatever emancipatory elements Zionism may provide for some Jews has been more than offset by the expulsion, occupation, repression, and killings of the indigenous Palestinian inhabitants. And while Zionism can certainly be seen as a national liberation movement for Jews, it also has some characteristics of a colonial settler state. And like other European nationalist movements that emerged in the late 19th century, there were certainly some racist assumptions at its foundation. And people can also reasonably object to any nationalist movement based on a particular ethnic or religious identity at the expense of others. But where anti-Zionism does cross the line into anti-Semitism is when it is used to describe some kind of monolithic conspiratorial movement in a manner traditionally used by anti-Semites to describe Jews. Indeed, claiming that the Zionists control the media or the government or financial institutions, that kind of thing. That's simply a rehashing of the old-fashioned anti-Semitic canards. Another example would be describing Zionism as its worst manifestations. So, for example, describing Israeli government policies, like bombing Palestinian neighborhoods, constructing Jewish-only settlements in occupied lands, bulldozing Palestinian homes as Zionist policy, ignores the many self-described Zionists in Israel and elsewhere in the world who oppose such practices. I mean, like other nationalist movements, there's a diversity of perspectives among Zionists. And one could still question the legitimacy of Zionism, but it's wrong to represent it as its worst historical elements. Another factor is it anti-Semitic to focus more on challenging Israeli policies or US military, economic, and financial support for Israel more than other repressive governments? I mean, one could argue that the Israeli government is by far the primary recipient of US military assistance. Its violations of international legal norms have been shielded by more than 40 US vetoes in the UN Security Council. It receives unconditional support from an overwhelming bipartisan majority of Congress, even among otherwise liberal Democrats who have spoken out against human rights abuses by other US allies. In addition, with the exception of Morocco's occupation of Western Sahara, it's the only case of a formally recognized foreign belligerent occupation of one country by another in which the occupier denies the subjected population its right to self-determination. And so while there are certainly governments in the world responsible for far more civilian deaths or other transgressions, Israel stands almost alone in violating this bedrock international legal principles. In any case, just as some people feel a calling to focus their energies on Tibet or Darfur or Western Sahara or Syria, Iran, Burma, or any other nation in which people are threatened and denied their rights, there's any number of reasons unrelated to any kind of prejudice or bigotry that could lead someone to focus more on Palestine. I mean, where one would suspect anti-Semitism, for example, if you criticize the Israeli occupation but defended Moroccan occupation of Western Sahara or the Russian occupation of Crimea, or or criticizing Israel bombing civilian targets while rationalizing for Syrian or Saudi attacks on civilian targets. And another issue is where anti-Semitism comes up is when people exaggerate, that blame U.S. Middle East policy on the Zionist lobby. I mean, yeah, exaggerating. I mean, Jewish influence as a means of absolving non-Jews who actually wield power responsibility, and that's been a favored approach of anti-Semites for centuries. I mean, indeed, those of us familiar with U.S. foreign policy recognize the long-standing willingness of the United States to rationalize and cover up human rights abuses and even war crimes by allies, and to exaggerate the cruelties and aggressiveness of perceived adversaries. I mean, you need to look no further than East Timor, Nicaragua, Angola, or other controversial U.S. policies to recognize that while right-wing Zionist groups, may have made reasonable debate regarding Israel and Palestine more difficult, the overall thrust of U.S. policy in the Middle East would unfortunately be pretty much the same without a pro-Israel lobby. And so again, exaggerating the power of the pro-Israel lobby, and pretending U.S. policy would otherwise be benign, I would argue does cross the line into anti-Semitism. In conclusion, I just say that any and all manifestations of anti-Semitism must be challenged, including those in relation to Israel. At the same time, we must not allow false charges of anti-Semitism to deter us from defending human rights of Palestinians and working for peace. Because there is no inherent contradiction in defending the rights of both Palestinians and Israelis, of Muslims and Jews. And we must challenge those who fail to recognize this reality. Human rights is worth the fight.